Welcome back. Today we're stepping into Harlem, 1952, where one quiet moment turned into a legend. The day a little girl walked straight up to Bumpy Johnson, a man feared across New York, and changed everything. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you care about real history backed by hard to find true data, not rumors, go ahead and subscribe because every story here is built from deep research, cross-checked facts, and hours of digging so you get the truth, not just the drama. Harlem in 1952 was a place breathing with contradiction. On one block you could hear jazz spilling out of basement clubs, laughter echoing off brownstone steps, and preachers calling out hope from church doors. On the next block there was silence, the kind that meant everyone was watching, measuring, surviving. This was a neighborhood alive with culture, pride, and resilience, also shaped by poverty, racism, and an unspoken code of the streets. Post-war America was booming. Harlem didn't feel that prosperity the same way. Jobs were scarce, housing was crowded, and discrimination pressed down hard on black communities. Many families lived packed into aging buildings, doing everything they could to get by. Kids grew up fast here, learning early which corners were safe, which faces carried authority, and which names were never spoken lightly. Despite the struggle, Harlem was still a cultural capital. Writers, musicians, and thinkers walked the same sidewalks as hustlers and enforcers. Jazz legends played late into the night, and the soundtracks of trumpets and saxophones gave the neighborhood its pulse. There was pride in Harlem, deep, stubborn pride. Even when the rest of the city looked away or looked down, power in Harlem didn't always wear a badge or a suit. Real authority often lived in the shadows, enforced not by law books, but by reputation. Everyone knew who truly controlled the streets, the numbers and the protection. Respect wasn't optional, it was survival. Children absorbed this reality just by watching how adults crossed the street, lowered their voices, or paused conversations when certain men passed by. Police presence was tense and complicated. Raids were common, trust was rare, and justice often felt uneven. Many residents believed the system wasn't built for them, so they relied on their own rules and their own protectors. That environment allowed powerful figures to rise, men who filled the gaps left by a broken system, for better or worse. For a child growing up in Harlem at that time, fear and familiarity existed side by side. Kids played stickball in the streets, skipped rope on cracked pavement, and ran errands for their parents, all while absorbing the dangers around them. They knew which adults were kind, which were strict, and which carried an aura that made even grown men step aside. This was the Harlem of 1952, a place where legends were born not in headlines, in everyday moments. A neighborhood where one unexpected interaction could ripple through the streets, whispered from stoop to stoop, growing larger with each retelling. And in a world like that, even the smallest figure, a little girl, could step into history without meaning to. Bumpy Johnson, born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, was far more complex than the monster or hero labels later attached to his name. To the outside world, he was a feared Harlem crime boss, but to many inside the neighborhood, he was something closer to a paradox. He was a man shaped by violence, yet governed by a strict personal code, Understanding who Bumpy really was means understanding the world that created him and the rules he chose to live by. His nickname, Bumpy, came from a noticeable bump on his head, a small detail that followed him from childhood into legend. Growing up in South Carolina and later Harlem, Bumpy learned early that intelligence mattered as much as strength. He was known to read constantly, especially history and philosophy, and could quote poetry just as easily as he could issue threats. This combination of intellect and intimidation set him apart from other street figures of his time. By the 1930s and 1940s, Bumpy had risen through Harlem's underworld, eventually becoming the dominant power broker in the neighborhood. He controlled gambling operations, enforced order, and negotiated directly with Italian mafia families, something almost unheard of for a black man in organized crime at the time. He wasn't just surviving in a racist system. He was forcing his way into spaces that were meant to exclude him. What made Bumpy especially dangerous was not reckless violence, restraint. He believed unnecessary cruelty brought unwanted attention. When violence happened, it was calculated, purposeful, and meant to send a message. That reputation made him someone people feared crossing, but also someone whose word carried weight. In Harlem, promise from Bumpy Johnson was often seen as more reliable than protection from the police. At the same time, many residents saw another side of him. He paid rent for struggling families, helped people avoid eviction, and quietly funded education for neighborhood kids. These actions weren't charity in the traditional sense. They reinforced loyalty. They also filled a void left by neglect and discrimination. To some, he was a criminal. To others, he was a protector operating outside the law because the law had failed them. Bumpy also had a deep sense of pride in Harlem itself. He saw the neighborhood as his responsibility and his kingdom. Outsiders who disrespected Harlem or preyed on its people often found themselves dealing with him. Territorial loyalty earned him respect even among those who feared him, because he was seen as someone who kept worse chaos at bay. So, who was Bumpy Johnson really? He was a product of systemic injustice, a self-made power broker, a ruthless enforcer, and a strangely principled man all at once. He lived in the gray space between villain and guardian. Complexity is exactly why moments involving him, especially unexpected ones, carried so much weight. When someone approached Bumpy Johnson, it was never just a meeting. It was an encounter with Harlem's unwritten law. On the streets of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson's reputation moved faster than he ever did. You didn't need to see him to feel his presence. People spoke his name carefully, often lowering their voices, sometimes avoiding it altogether. For many, just knowing Bumpy controlled an area was enough to change behavior. Arguments ended quicker, deals were kept cleaner. Outsiders learned fast that Harlem wasn't a place to test limits. What made his reputation so powerful was consistency. Bumpy was known as a man who followed through. If he gave his word, it mattered. If he issued a warning, it wasn't empty. This predictability made him feared, but it also made him respected. In a world where chaos could erupt at any moment, people understood the rules around Bumpy, and that clarity carried its own kind of safety. Stories about him circulated like street currency. Some said he could walk alone through the roughest blocks without a weapon and come out untouched. Others talked about his sharp mind, how he could outthink rivals instead of overpowering them. These stories grew with each retelling, blurring the line between fact and legend, but they all pointed to the same conclusion: Bumpy Johnson was not someone to underestimate. Importantly, his reputation wasn't built on random violence. Unlike many street figures who ruled through fear alone, Bumpy used control and intelligence as much as force. People knew he disliked unnecessary bloodshed because it drew attention and disrupted business. Restraint made his threats more frightening, not less, because when action did come, everyone knew it was deliberate. Among young men in Harlem, Bumpy's name carried a strange mix of warning and aspiration. Some saw him as proof that a black man could hold real power in a city designed to deny it. Others saw him as a cautionary tale, understanding that his influence came with constant danger, surveillance, and enemies. Either way, his reputation shaped how people imagined their own futures. For everyday residents, shop owners, parents, elders, Bumpy's reputation was complicated. Some felt safer knowing he discouraged random crime in areas he controlled. Others resented the fact that his power existed at all, a reminder of how little protection they received from official institutions. Even those who disliked him admitted one thing: life shifted when Bumpy Johnson decided to get involved. By the early 1950s, his reputation had reached a point where even silence spoke volumes. A pause in conversation, a glance down the street, a sudden change in tone. These were signs that Bumpy's shadow was nearby. So when word spread that a little girl had approached him directly, it wasn't just surprising, it was unthinkable. On streets ruled by reputation, single act carried more weight than anyone could have imagined. Power in Harlem during the early 1950s didn't flow in straight lines. Official authority existed: police precincts, city officials, laws on paper, but on the ground, power was fragmented and often contested. Many residents felt disconnected from institutions meant to protect them, which created space for alternative systems of control to take root. Respect, fear, loyalty, and reputation mattered just as much as legal authority, sometimes more. Economic inequality played a huge role in shaping these dynamics. With limited access to jobs, fair housing, and credit, entire communities were forced to operate in survival mode. Informal economies filled the gaps, and those who controlled money, protection, or opportunity gained influence quickly. Power became less about titles and more about who could actually get things done when the system failed. Race also defined the boundaries of power. Harlem was a predominantly black neighborhood in a city where political and economic control rested largely elsewhere. This imbalance meant decisions affecting Harlem were often made by people who didn't live there and didn't fully understand its realities. As a result, local figures, both legitimate and criminal, rose to prominence because they were present, accessible, and responsive in ways the city often wasn't. Street power followed its own rules. Territory mattered. So did alliances, favors, and history. Power wasn't absolute. It had to be maintained daily through negotiation and enforcement. A person could be influential one week and vulnerable the next if they lost respect or backing. This constant tension kept everyone alert and cautious, especially around those known to sit near the top of the hierarchy. Community leaders, pastors, and business owners held another kind of power, moral and social. They could calm tensions, spread information, and shape public opinion within the neighborhood. While they didn't control violence or money the way street bosses did, their influence was real and often quietly respected. Sometimes these worlds overlapped, creating uneasy balances rather than clear divisions. For ordinary residents, navigating these power dynamics was a daily calculation. Knowing who to approach for help, who to avoid, and when to stay silent was part of survival. Parents taught children not just manners, awareness, how to read a room, a street, a moment. Power wasn't abstract. It was something you felt in your body when you walked certain blocks or crossed certain people. In that environment, actions carried extra meaning. Who spoke to whom, who dared to ask a question, who broke an unspoken rule, all of it mattered. So when someone without status, without protection, and without fear stepped forward, it disrupted the entire balance. In a place governed by carefully maintained power, even the smallest unexpected act could send shockwaves through Harlem. The little girl at the center of this story didn't come from power, privilege, or protection. She was a child of Harlem, growing up in a neighborhood where kids learned early how to stay alert, listen closely, and mind their surroundings. Her world was shaped by crowded apartments, watchful adults, and streets that taught lessons faster than classrooms ever could. Like many children there, she understood far more than people might have expected. Her family background was ordinary for the time. They were likely working class, possibly struggling, doing their best to make ends meet in a city that offered limited opportunities. Parents in Harlem often worked long hours, and children took on responsibilities early, running errands, watching siblings, and navigating the neighborhood on their own. Independence wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. She would have grown up hearing names spoken carefully, learning which adults commanded respect and which ones people avoided. Even if no one explained it directly, she would have noticed how conversations changed when certain figures were mentioned. Children are observant, and in Harlem, observation was a survival skill passed down quietly from one generation to the next. At the same time, she was still a child, shaped by innocence as much as awareness. Kids in Harlem laughed, played, and dreamed just like kids anywhere else. They jumped rope, played stickball, and imagined futures beyond the blocks they knew so well. Mix of innocence and street awareness created a unique kind of courage, one that didn't always recognize danger the way adults did. Her background likely included hardship, but also community. Neighbors watched out for one another, and children often belonged to the block as much as to their families. Elders corrected them, shop owners knew their names, and familiar faces lined the streets. This sense of belonging may have given her a confidence that felt natural, even in situations where adults would hesitate. It's also possible she had a personal reason, something that touched her family directly, whether it was fear, hope, desperation, or a sense of fairness. Something in her life pushed her toward action. Children don't usually confront power without a reason, even if they can't fully articulate it themselves. That's what made her background so important. She wasn't reckless, and she wasn't powerful. She was simply a child shaped by her environment, carrying both vulnerability and bravery in equal measure. And in a neighborhood ruled by reputation and restraint, her presence alone challenged expectations, because no one ever expects history to pause for a little girl. She didn't approach him on a dare, and it wasn't an accident. Something compelled her to step forward, something stronger than fear. In a neighborhood where adults carefully calculated every move around men like Bumpy Johnson, child didn't cross that line without a reason. Whatever pushed her came from urgency, not curiosity. It may have been need. In Harlem, people often went to power where power actually worked. If someone in her family was in trouble, facing eviction, threatened, or caught in a situation no one else could fix, Bumpy Johnson's name might have seemed like the last door left to knock on. Children absorb these realities faster than we think, especially when they watch adults run out of options. It also could have been injustice she couldn't ignore. Kids have a sharp sense of fairness, and when something feels wrong, act before fear has time to catch up. If she believed someone had been hurt, treated unfairly, or pushed too far, she may have felt that staying silent was worse than speaking up. To her, approaching Bumpy might not have felt dangerous. It might have felt necessary. There's also the possibility that she believed in his reputation in a different way than adults did. While grown ups feared his power. Children often hear the other stories too, the ones about him helping families, paying rent, or protecting people when no one else would. To a child, that can turn a feared man into a potential protector, someone who listens when others won't. Her age mattered. Children don't fully grasp consequences the way adults do, especially long-term ones. She likely wasn't thinking about what could happen to her, only about what needed to be said in that moment. Kind of honesty, unfiltered and unguarded, is rare in a world built on caution and calculation. There's also a deeper layer, courage shaped by environment. Growing up in Harlem meant facing reality head on every day. Fear didn't disappear, but it didn't always stop action either. She may have learned simply by living there. Sometimes you speak up because silence costs more. Whatever her exact reason was, it came from a place of truth, not strategy, ambition. Just a child acting on instinct, emotion, and belief. And that's what made it so powerful. In a world where everyone knew the rules, she broke them without even realizing they existed. And that single decision set the stage for everything that followed. The encounter didn't happen in a courtroom or a backroom meeting. It unfolded in a place that made it even more shocking. It was somewhere public, likely a Harlem street or sidewalk, where life moved in plain view, and everyone understood the risks of being seen. This wasn't a hidden moment. It was exposed, raw, and impossible to ignore. Bumpy Johnson was known to move through his neighborhood calmly, often surrounded by a quiet awareness rather than a visible entourage. People noticed when he was nearby, even before they saw him. Conversations softened, footsteps slowed, and eyes shifted. The atmosphere itself changed, as if the street knew power was passing through it. The little girl approached him in that shared space, where adults normally stepped aside or kept their distance. She didn't have the cover of privacy or protection. Whatever she had to say, she said it in the open, where witnesses could see her small frame standing in front of one of the most feared men in Harlem. The setting mattered because Harlem streets were governed by unwritten rules. Children didn't interrupt business. They didn't speak to men like Bumpy unless spoken to. By stepping forward there, she wasn't just addressing a man. She was disrupting a social order everyone else carefully followed. People nearby would have frozen, pretending not to watch while watching closely. Some may have expected shouting. Others may have feared sudden violence. Even a raised voice from Bumpy Johnson could send ripples through a block. The tension of that moment lived not just between the two of them. In every silent observer around them, the street itself became part of the story. Brownstones, storefronts, stoops, passing cars framed the encounter, anchoring it in everyday Harlem life. That normalcy made the moment feel surreal, time slowing down in a place where life usually moved fast and hard. Because it happened there, in full view of the neighborhood, the story spread quickly. It wasn't second-hand rumor born in whispers. It was witnessed reality. People had seen it with their own eyes, and that visibility gave the encounter weight. In Harlem, what happened on the street became history, and that day, the street was watching. Witnesses to the encounter remember it as a moment frozen between fear and fascination. People on the street, who had long been conditioned to step aside for Bumpy Johnson, found themselves watching in disbelief as a small child confronted a man whose reputation could silence a room. The contrast, the child's size against his presence, made the event feel almost surreal. Adults nearby instinctively gauged the situation, some ready to intervene, others holding their breath to see what would unfold. In a neighborhood where every interaction with figures like Bumpy was risky, the crowd's reaction reflected both awe and anxiety. No one wanted to act first because the outcome was uncertain and the rules were being rewritten before their eyes. Some witnesses later described the girl's courage as almost unnatural. She spoke clearly, moved deliberately, and maintained her composure, which unsettled Bumpy Johnson's usual aura of absolute control. People noticed her confidence. It wasn't defiance for the sake of it, but something deeper, something that demanded attention. Others focused on Bumpy's reaction, watching closely for any hint of anger or aggression. In most encounters, a man like him would assert dominance immediately, making an example of anyone challenging his authority. But in this case, he paused, studied her, and responded in a way that shocked even those who knew him best. Children who witnessed it were likely inspired, seeing someone their own age stand against the adult structures that often felt untouchable. Adults, meanwhile, were left recalibrating their understanding of the neighborhood's dynamics. Everyone recognized that the moment was more than unusual. It was historic in its subtlety and power. The presence of witnesses also meant that the story could not be contained. As the crowd dispersed, whispers spread from stoop to stoop, from shop to shop, cementing the encounter in the collective memory of the block. Each retelling added perspective, detail, and awe, building the legend almost immediately. Ultimately, the witnesses were crucial in transforming a private, tense interaction into a moment that would resonate through Harlem. Their observations preserved the drama, the courage, and the unexpected humanity of the encounter, allowing it to echo beyond that single street, becoming a story repeated for generations. Bumpy Johnson's reaction to the little girl was nothing short of extraordinary. People who knew him expected intimidation, threats, or even immediate punishment for anyone who dared approach him, especially a child. Yet, instead of reacting with anger, he paused, studied her, and seemed to weigh the situation carefully. That moment of hesitation was unlike anything witnesses had seen before, and it changed the energy on the street entirely. He listened, truly listened. According to those present, he didn't dismiss her or brush her off as a nuisance. Instead, he focused on her words, giving the interaction the weight of consideration that most adults rarely received in his presence. This attentiveness alone shocked onlookers. Bumpy Johnson's reputation was built on control, not conversation, yet here he was engaging with someone who had nothing to offer him in terms of power or influence. His demeanor remained calm but authoritative. He didn't lean in menacingly, and he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he maintained the balance of command while acknowledging her presence. Witnesses later remarked that it was as if he recognized a rare courage, and perhaps even honesty, in her approach. The usual street rules seemed suspended in that brief encounter. There was a tension in the air, thick enough to be felt by everyone nearby. People expected a dramatic outburst or an abrupt dismissal, but Bumpy's restraint created a sense of awe. Observers realized that his reaction wasn't weakness, it was deliberate. He understood the power of the moment and chose to respond in a way that preserved his authority while also honoring the unexpected bravery of a child. Some accounts suggest he smiled slightly, a gesture rare enough to catch attention. Whether it was amusement, respect, or recognition of the courage before him, the small gesture humanized him in a way the neighborhood hadn't seen often. It was a reminder that Bumpy Johnson, for all his fearsome reputation, was capable of judgment beyond violence. His reaction also sent an unspoken message to the neighborhood: authority could be tempered with wisdom, and respect could be earned in unconventional ways. For the people watching, this encounter challenged what they thought they knew about him. It suggested that power was not just about fear, but about understanding the right moments to show it and the right moments to hold it back. By the time the interaction ended, the witnesses were left in awe, carrying with them a story of a man who could terrify or protect, punish or listen, all in a single moment. Bumpy Johnson's reaction became the pivot around which the legend of that day was built, a reminder that even in a world dominated by fear and power, courage and humanity could coexist. The immediate consequences of the encounter were felt across the block, almost instantly. People who had been lingering nearby realized that the rules they had followed for years, who could speak to whom, who could approach certain men, had been challenged in front of their eyes. The little girl's bravery shifted the balance, however subtly, and everyone present understood that something extraordinary had just occurred. Word traveled fast. In a neighborhood like Harlem, where news spreads from stoop to stoop and from store to store, the story of a child confronting Bumpy Johnson became the talk of the streets almost immediately. Adults recounted what they saw with a mixture of disbelief and admiration, while children were quietly inspired, recognizing that even those considered untouchable could be approached with courage. For Bumpy Johnson himself, the encounter reinforced his awareness of the neighborhood dynamics. He recognized that power was not just about fear, it was also about perception. People saw him in a new light that day, not as a man who would crush anyone who challenged him, but as someone who could respond with both authority and discernment. Perception would influence how others interacted with him in the days and weeks to follow. The little girl, meanwhile, became a quiet symbol of audacity and innocence. While she may not have realized the impact immediately, adults around her would speak of her courage for years. In a world where children were expected to stay out of adult matters, her actions showed that even the smallest voice could demand attention and respect in the right moment. Neighborhood elders and observers began reflecting on the power of reputation and human interaction. They noted that even someone as feared as Bumpy could be approached under certain circumstances, and that courage, honesty, and timing mattered as much as size or authority. The encounter subtly reshaped how people navigated the streets, teaching lessons about bravery and the unpredictability of human response. There were no dramatic arrests, violent reprisals, or legal consequences, but the social ripples were immediate. The story became a shared memory, a teaching moment, and a point of pride for the community. It reminded everyone that moments of fearlessness could leave lasting impressions far beyond what anyone might have expected. Ultimately, the immediate consequences were less about punishment or reward and more about awareness. Both the neighborhood and Bumpy Johnson himself had experienced a shift in perception. What began as a simple, bold act by a little girl grew into a moment that redefined interactions, challenged assumptions, and left an indelible mark on Harlem's collective memory. Once the encounter was over, the story spread throughout New York like wildfire. Harlem was buzzing first, with people retelling what they had seen on the streets. Stoops, storefronts, and corner newsstands became stages for the story, as each retelling added new layers of awe, disbelief, and admiration for the little girl's courage. It was a tale too remarkable to keep quiet, and neighbors shared it with anyone who would listen. Soon, the news traveled beyond Harlem's borders. Other boroughs, curious journalists, and even those in City Hall began hearing whispers of the child who had approached Bumpy Johnson, a man whose name alone inspired fear. The sheer audacity of a child standing up to someone so powerful captured the imagination of the wider public. People couldn't stop talking about it, and the story quickly became symbolic of courage and unexpected bravery. Newspapers and local tabloids eventually picked up the story, though details varied depending on who was telling it. Some focused on the danger she faced, highlighting the contrast between her innocence and Bumpy's notorious reputation. Others emphasized the neighborhood's vibrant life and culture, noting how even amidst struggle, moments of heroism could shine through. The variations in the story only fueled its reach, as each retelling carried a slightly different flavor, making it feel larger than life. Word of the encounter also reached social circles connected to both Harlem's community leaders and organized crime observers. People debated what it meant for the neighborhood's balance of power, questioning whether a child could genuinely alter perceptions of a man like Bumpy Johnson. Even adults who prided themselves on knowing the streets were forced to reconsider what courage and influence looked like. The story inspired other children and families in Harlem. Kids retold it to their friends as a lesson in bravery, while parents reflected on the unpredictable ways in which the young could act boldly in moments of truth. The narrative became part of oral history, passed down in households and neighborhoods long after the initial event. The encounter also contributed to Bumpy Johnson's evolving legend. People remembered that he had listened, had paused, and had responded without unnecessary violence. The story reinforced the idea that his power was not only about intimidation, but also about judgment and discretion. It became one of the defining anecdotes that shaped his public persona for decades. By the time the story had fully circulated, it had transcended a single moment. It became part of New York's collective memory, a story told not just for the shock or drama, for the lessons about courage, human response, and the unexpected ways individuals could challenge authority. What began as a simple street encounter had grown into a tale that would echo through generations. The lasting legacy of that day extends far beyond the immediate shock and the stories whispered on Harlem streets. What started as a single, daring act by a little girl became a symbol of courage, proving that even the most unlikely individuals could influence people who seemed untouchable. That moment reminded the neighborhood, and eventually the wider world, that bravery doesn't have an age limit. In the years that followed, the story became part of Harlem's collective memory. Parents told their children about it, not just as a legend, as a lesson in facing fear with honesty and determination. Teachers, community leaders, and local storytellers referenced the event as an example of how courage, respect, and boldness could challenge expectations in ways adults often overlooked. For Bumpy Johnson, the encounter subtly shaped how people remembered him. It added a layer of humanity to his otherwise fearsome reputation. People recalled that he had responded with attention, not aggression, and that he had acknowledged courage when it appeared unexpectedly. This rare display of discernment became a key part of his enduring mythos, showing that power could coexist with judgment. Culturally, the story became emblematic of Harlem itself, a neighborhood defined by resilience, intelligence, and unexpected heroism. It captured the vibrancy and unpredictability of the streets, the blend of danger and community, and the way everyday life could produce moments that were historic without anyone planning them. Harlem's identity was, in part, reflected in that single street encounter. Historians and storytellers later used the tale to illustrate broader truths about the era. The 1950s were a time of tension and transformation in New York, especially in communities often marginalized by official systems. The encounter highlighted the informal power structures, the courage required to navigate them, and the humanity that could surface even in the harshest environments. The story also inspired countless retellings in books, articles, and oral histories. Each recounting preserved different details, but all captured the essential truth that a small, seemingly powerless individual could leave an indelible mark on people, communities, and legends. It became a teaching tool for generations, illustrating the unexpected ways influence and respect can emerge. Ultimately, the legacy of that day is a testament to the intersection of courage, reputation, and humanity. A little girl's simple, bold action disrupted expectations, reshaped perceptions, and became a lasting symbol of how even the smallest voices can echo through history. It reminds us that in a world dominated by power and fear, bravery and honesty can leave a footprint far larger than anyone imagines.